Good evening. My name is Ben Kashor, and I'm the Li Ka-shing Professor in Public Management at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth webinar series on how to build a fit-for-purpose policy institute on environment and sustainability in the context of Singapore, ASEAN, and Asia. This institute's idea is traced back to Dean Danny Quah, who over the last few years recognized that the environmental and sustainability challenges facing Asia are not, and Singapore and ASEAN are not just about technically important questions that engineers and scientists can bring us around carbon capture and storage and how ecologies function and behave, and our impacts on them, but also the role of policy and governance in shaping a sustainable future. As part of that effort, we've engaged in conversations over the last 3 months in these webinar formats with government officials across Singapore, ASEAN, and the world, with corporate leaders, and last time with non-governmental and nonprofit organizations. Today, we're going to talk to 4 leading experts on how policy think tanks themselves, as scholars and conducting analysis and scholarship, can be best built to achieve and help governments and stakeholders meet their needs. So we're talking today about the scholarly experience about how to design in the best way forward this kind of institute to make a difference for society and governments at all levels. So with that, what I'm going to do now is introduce our 4 speakers. I'm going to ask individually. I'm going to introduce our first speaker and then ask him the first question and proceed that way to the other 3 additional speakers as well. Once I do that and we ask our first round of questions, I will then come around with a second round of questions, followed by a third. At that point, we seek your questions that you can put into the question and answer box, and we can engage it back and forth with the audience. But our main goal here is not to ask for definitive statements, but rather to engage in a conversation about how to best design this kind of institute that we feel will fill an important gap in the context of Singapore and Asia. So with that, I'm going to first introduce our first speaker, Professor Navraz Dubhash. And I must say, before I introduce him, that all of our speakers have incredibly impressive backgrounds. I'm going to give you just a brief overview of their impressive record. But Professor Dubhash is a professor at the Center for Policy Research and adjunct senior research fellow right here in our very own Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He has been engaged actively in global and national debates on climate change, air quality, energy, and water as a researcher, as a policy advisor, and also as an activist over the last 25 years. Of the many things he's done, and you can see in his CV, includes being coordinating lead author for a chapter on the policies and institutions, for the 6th assessment report of the very famous Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He also serves on the United Nations Environment Programme's GAP Reporting Steering Committee and has been a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for the United Nations Climate Action Summit in 2019. That's just a short snippet of the things that he's done, including authoring many books and publications on these topics. So, Professor Dubhash, with that in mind, I'm going to ask you our first opening question that I will also then pose of our other guests following your response. And the question is the following. It's a basic one, but an important one. What do you feel, based on your experience, are the most pressing issues on environment and sustainability that a policy institute in the context of Asia, Singapore, and ASEAN ought to address?
Well, first, thank you so much, Professor Cashwell, for having me on this panel. I really look forward to hearing from our fellow panelists, and I'm delighted also to be welcomed to the Lee Kuan Yew School. So thank you for that as well. This is obviously a very large question, and I will speak more or less to my strengths, but or to at least what I know better, without presuming that that is the whole picture. I think when we talk about what is necessary for a school of or an institute of sustainability and environment to really focus on, the trick is, I think, that people tend to relate better and policymakers tend to relate better to concrete things that speak to their immediate environment. So concerns around, for example, plastics and its use, concerns around the oceans, things that are tangible, are obviously something that motivates people and makes it perhaps easier to engage. At the same time, we're in a period when I think we are really sort of rethinking humanity's relationship with nature in a very fundamental way, spurred by meta issues like climate change. And climate change has become, in a sense, kind of a larger a lens through which we view relationships of sustainability, how humans interact with nature. But it's also this incredibly abstract idea. It involves understanding greenhouse gases, the physics behind climate change, the link between fossil fuels, and it feels like everything is changing at the same time. The whole relationship since the Industrial Revolution between development and fossil fuel use is on the table in a sense. So the trick is, I think, to span both the concrete and the abstract. We can't avoid the scale of something like climate change, but we have to find a way of relating it back to what people care about. And so the kinds of ways that I found useful to talk about this are to make linkages between large, complex, wicked problems, in the phrase that you use a lot, like climate change, and things that people care about. So in India, where I'm from, air pollution, and right now Delhi is, I'm guessing, I haven't looked at the data, the most polluted city in the world, as it frequently is at this time of year. But there are important linkages between coal-fired power plants and air pollution and coal-fired power plants and climate change. So you might use different linkages at different times to get at different sets of issues, but you have to frame something like climate change in a way that makes a lot of sense. For this center, I think invariably engaging with climate change is going to be important, but equally engaging with, and I would put two things at the top of my list of very specific issues for this region: plastics in the oceans.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up with you on this really important point you're making about concrete and abstract. Because as you've written a lot about, one of the challenges is a lot of the concrete impacts will happen into the future, which makes it abstract as well. So how do you handle this in your own thoughts about then where you place that emphasis on abstract and concrete, given they eventually end up in the same place?
That's a great question, and particularly in a country in a very poor country like India, right, trying to persuade people to prioritize climate change impacts, which are increasingly, mind you, becoming apparent around the world, and the science of attribution, as it's called, is making it easier to join the dots between emissions and outcomes and negative outcomes. But nonetheless, there is some probability associated with it, and there's some future time associated with it. Well, how do you stack that up against, say, sanitation? Sanitation challenges in India, which are affecting the life prospects and the health and the mental development of millions of Indian children, right? It's very challenging. So the way in which I find it useful to bring these two together is using this idea of co-benefits, that what you would do to address climate change often brings gains for things that are tractable to people. The way in which you design more livable cities that are conducive to a healthier lifestyle built around walking and cycling are also good for climate change. Less congestion, less air pollution, again, good for urban dwellers, good for climate change. So I think that sort of narrative building around things like co-benefits is a really good way of in a sense, dealing with the abstraction that climate change represents.
Yeah, thank you. And I also note that you're giving us also a very positive story about how we can actually do things that are a benefit to humans and also the ecology. We'll come back to those in future questions, but I'm not going to turn for her answer to the question I just posed on the most pressing issues to Maria Ivanova. It's very hard for me to introduce Maria Ivanova because we go way back as far as her being a doctoral student when I was at Yale University, and then also co-teaching with me a class on this very topic of global environmental governance. And has since done amazing things. I'm now going to just review for you a little bit, but I really want a whole half an hour to go through her impressive impacts. And that I'm very excited to have her on board. But just briefly then, she is Associate Professor of Global Governance and Director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is also a visiting scholar at the Center for Collective Intelligence at MIT. And she was appointed recently to a 4-year term to the World Climate Research Program Joint Scientific Committee. Her career has been marked by teaching excellence and policy leadership, bridging, and what's so important for our conversation today, academia and policy. Her work includes a focus on the performance of international institutions, as well as the implementation of international environmental agreements, and of course, sustainability. She's been studying, especially among many things, the origins and the history of the United Nations Environment Program. And recently, this research culminated in her being published in the world's top environmental book publisher series, the MIT Environmental Earth Systems series. And the title of the book is called The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP at 50. Now, I'm just going to say, because there's so many things to say as well, that this book has been so well received that it was named one of the 12 new books to read on climate change by Yale Climate Connections, and one of 7 must-read books on environment by the World Economic Forum. So with that, I welcome, just in a brief way, Professor Maria Ivanova.
Thank you, Professor Ben, because it's really a pleasure to be here, because I am indeed one of your disciples. And here we see that as students, we are not only learners, we are co-creators of knowledge. And we continue to interact with our professors throughout when we become professors in our own right. So it's really great to see the value chain of education through this interaction. And I want to turn your questions on the challenges a little bit on its head, and because as Navroz was talking, I was thinking, but what are the challenges to address? I completely agree with the oceans and the plastics, given where you are in the world. And these are issues that are coming on the international agenda, and they can be linked to climate change, to biodiversity, to pollution. But then I thought, but what are the challenges to creating what you're creating? So I'm just going to turn it on its head, and rather than what challenges to address in terms of substance, I will think with you a little bit about what challenges might be there as you're trying to set up something new. Because when I joined the University of Massachusetts, Boston, now 11 years ago, one of my conditions for taking this job was to create a Center for Governance and Sustainability. I said, yes, I will come here if I would be allowed, if you can help me create a Center for Governance and Sustainability. And so I'm coming in from that direction.
Right.
And as you know, Ben, we worked together at Yale, where I was a research assistant at the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. And so have seen how these centers operate from the point of view of a student as a research assistant, whose entire research agenda was shaped by the kind of policy work that I was doing while studying, and then created such a center that now shapes the research agendas within our research unit as both faculty and students. And so I was thinking of three main challenges as you're putting this new institute together, these ideas. It's like, one, you'll have to clearly articulate what is your value added. Is it on the substantive side, on the practice side, on the process side, right? And when we are in academic institutions, we engage in research, in teaching, and in service, in outreach. And you can articulate a very clear value added in all of these three areas. And a challenge then to be setting this institute up is the current political context, the geopolitical context within which we operate, that is challenging multilateralism as an idea. And we're seeing this internationally. And so how can you, from where you are locationally, both in terms of research substance, but also geographically, articulate a clear value added in terms of the research that this institute will carry out, in terms of the teaching that you will engage in, and in terms of the contribution to a wider policy agenda. And so second challenge to think through as you're conceptualizing this center is, and related to the value added, but is to understand and design a strategy for cooperation with others. Who will you be cooperating with? Right. Institutes, entities, but also who are you competing with? Right? In the world, there are always competitors, but we have to think of how then to turn the competitors into collaborators. And I think, knowing you've always collaborated. And this is what defines Professor Benjamin Kashur. If you've always looked for areas of collaboration. And so I would encourage your team to identify currently the competitors and design a strategy of how to turn that environment into one for collaboration. And then finally is the challenge of sustainability. One, it will be in your title, is the Institute for Environment and Sustainability. But two, is a critical issue to ensure that this institute is sustainable, that it's sustainable in terms of its finances, that it can support its core operations, that it's also sustainable in terms of the demand for its work, that there is constant demand, that there is constant requirement for you to engage. And that is where I think you will capitalize on your cooperation aptitude and the way that you work in this world. But ultimately, all of these things, and especially the sustainability piece, will evolve over time. Just like the wicked problems that you use so often, and I have co-opted and use it because in Boston, where I am based, wicked means something totally different. You will see t-shirts around of people saying wicked smart, SMAHT, and saying, yes, I go to Harvard, because that's how we speak in Boston. Well, the population. And so the wicked problems also mean evolving over time, right, and they require evolving solutions. And I think at the core of this institute, you'll have to budget in and bake in that evolution.
Yeah, Maria, just a quick follow-up. I find your answer is very intriguing. Your point about sustainability of the institute itself, which I really value. These should live on beyond a single person. They should have a life, a collective life of their own, right? But I'm also intrigued by the way you turn the question around, because I was thinking about when you asked about competitors, the different identities that different institutes have. So I engage with collaborators who work on centers for sustainable business, for example. And their target is not public policy, but actually company policy. So I'm wondering in that context, whether do you see a difference in the kinds of problems that an institute looking at policy and governance, public policy governance, would look at and provide knowledge around than an institute on corporate sustainability? Do you see any differences in the problems they would look at, or just are they also, in your perspective, competitors or possible collaborators?
So any competitor is a possible collaborator. That's my stance. And ultimately, we even compete with ourselves, right? This is what should be baked into our identities, that we compete with ourselves. We always want to be better than what we were before. But it's a very good question in terms of the business institutes and that corporate governance and the public policy governance. So yes, there are similarities, because at the core of the demands to both is, let's resolve a question, let's resolve a particular problem. But I think there will be differences in the kinds of problems. And the business demand will be for perhaps a more concrete problem, perhaps a problem that needs to be addressed through market mechanisms. And you have to think about the immediate returns. In the public policy setting, we'll come back, we indeed come back to what Navroz was talking about, is these more abstract problems or more long-term problems where you have to think of the collective good and the collective outcome. And part of your answer invariably will be collective action. And so in a sense, they're more difficult questions and they're more difficult problems to resolve, because not only do you have to present the policy options, but you have to also say, how are we going to get there and have a collective outcome for the collective good in the longer term. And you will need much more cooperation in that and a longer term thinking.
Yeah, that's a nice reinforcement of Professor Naraz's point about, or Devash's point about the need to think about the long term in today's policymaking processes. How does this institute link to those long-term challenges? Very, very nicely put. It's my pleasure now to welcome our third speaker. I mentioned before that we're trying to fill a gap with this new institute in how to think about policy design and governance around questions that come to us usually from the scientific community that exposes the problems we're facing, from pollution to climate change to deforestation, and also provides solutions, engineering solutions on things like solar panels, and of course, nature-based solutions. All these communities matter as well. And so I'm pleased to introduce somebody who's got a foot in both the research think tank world and also the technical world to help us puzzle through these questions. So just again, briefly, a long CV as well. Professor Shane Snyder is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and the executive director for the Nanyang Environment and Water Research Institute and the president's chair in water technologies at Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. He joined NTU after serving as a professor of chemical and environmental engineering and the co-director of the Water and Energy Sustainable Technology Center at the University of Arizona in the United States. For over 20 years, he's focused on the identification of fate and health relevance of emerging water pollutants. He and his team have produced over 200 manuscripts and book chapters on contaminant analysis, treatment, and toxicology, and he also serves as the editor-in-chief for the international journal Chemosphere. And I'm going to stop there to say that's a short bio of a very long and important impact that he's had. And as you can see, though, he brings them these nice communities together. And so we're very curious about your perspective, Professor Schneider. And the first question again is, based in your world and your context and your research, what for you would be the most pressing sustainability challenges for this kind of institute to address?
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I might be a bit of an outlier coming in as an engineer and trying to share with you some of the challenges that we face. The institute that I'm at here at NURI, we're about 300 people in size. So we're a big entity with an endowment and philanthropic division too. So I would like to try to piece some of that together, both from a highly developed urban environment like Singapore versus the remote villages of Southeast Asia, where we actually try to deploy new technology to be more sustainable, both from, say, energy and carbon footprint, but also in security and water security and reliability. And so I mentioned there was just a meeting earlier this week with our ministers here in Singapore and ministers from the government of China. We had a very interesting and quite lengthy discussion about the same type of topic. And I'll echo what I said at that meeting, that from my point of view, what I think we really need to think about is how we can be more honest and more comprehensive as we look at life cycle assessments and cradle to grave type of decision making. One of the frustrating areas that I have is that in certain geopolitical situations, entities, or especially government entities, may look for short-term answers to, I think, what was mentioned before, long-term challenges. And unfortunately, some of the long-term solutions cost more than a short-term bandage. And this is where I find a bit of frustration. I can give maybe a very quick, tangible example. There's newer generations of membranes that are made from inorganic ceramics or from silicon carbide. Lifespans, we know, decades, likely centuries, but they do cost more. But if you would look at this across, say, 20 years, you realize that very quickly you could return that initial CapEx or capital investment in the savings in OpEx and the savings from, say, the competing polymeric, or even you could call it plastic if you wish, commonly used materials in membranes. So, if you're looking at how much would it cost today to build, and your term as an elected official might be 4 years, you might be tempted to go with that lower cost solution. But it's frustrating in a high-tech research environment where we know we have much more efficient but yet more expensive technology. So, I find that to be something I hope we can come back to. And even when I said honesty, there should be, I think, more transparency when we're talking about CO2 footprint, which was a big topic earlier this week. It's easy to look at, say, a per capita CO2 number and immediately start pointing fingers, which we found a bit of the case in our debate that we had earlier. But then we forget about things like, and I know it's coming up, I was happy to see biodiversity and conservation. We forget about CO2 sequestration by nature. And I think there needs to be a more holistic view on CO2 to also give maybe some bonus credit to those countries which preserve nature and serve as CO2 sinks by not destroying rainforests to build, say, agricultural development to feed a hungry nation. But again, just to be honest, to look at things holistically, not piece by piece, and maybe even oversimplify. And I wanted to come back to the first panelist on the plastics in the ocean. This is a great topic. It's gained a tremendous amount of inertia with a lot of studies. But, it's interesting that today we have solutions already for this. We could collect this plastic, we can convert it into diesel fuels very easily, not high tech, but we can also create carbon fibers. We can create a lot of new products, and we can do it pretty economically. The challenge is, how do we get people to segregate if that's needed? Now, maybe later, I don't want to go too deep into this, but and how do we get the feedstock secured? There's policy questions here that I think us as in the engineering community could really use a hand. But I'll circle back again to this kind of perception versus reality. There's a lot of perceived immediate fixes. And if I could be so bold as to put a debatable one out there, the switch to electric vehicles, it sounds fantastic on the surface, but it doesn't take it's a very thin veneer to scratch in and find out that a lot of the battery technology and components used in EVs are coming from very non-sustainable sources. They're the CO2 footprint of the mining and the purification and the movement and transport of these rare earth elements. We don't even know, it's not even disclosed. And so we immediately might jump to one conclusion and say, hey, let's all switch over to EV. But Volvo Corporation, I was impressed, recently said, well, it takes 70% more CO2 footprint for us to produce this EV than a conventional vehicle. And so, I guess for me, that's just an example, where I'd like to maybe just throw in there that I hope that as this kind of technical and engineering data are being communicated to policymakers, that they understand the complete life cycle consequences of their decisions and not look at maybe popular immediate opinion and how to maybe we can better communicate some of this complicated, if you will, engineering and scientific data in a way that's more perceivable for the general public and for our government officials, so that we can make decisions that have long-term benefit instead of that short-term bandage, as I call it. So that's my two-second rant or whatever.
Yeah, fantastic. Actually, I'm very grateful for your interventions for two reasons, actually. So first, Maria and I, both talked about our time at Yale University's Environment School. Most of our colleagues were environmental scientists, engineers, and so on, chemistry professors, and the like. And it's from them that we got the problem definitions that then drive us. And so for that reason, we've already proposed for the new institute to convene dialogues where the first question would be, know what the actual problem is. What's the state of the problem? What's the science of the problem? What are the possible solutions already there? And it's amazing how in the policy world, sometimes we forget about that and we go to the governance side and don't do the first step. So I really appreciate your point. It's fundamental. Now, you raised in your comments two things that I think are interesting, and that relates to the second reason why I'm grateful, which is you talked about then how do we get people to then know about this and behave accordingly? And also in our world, we talk about policy design. So I'm curious about then, let's say we were doing research both on how people behave and how they can respond to different kinds of incentives to change behavior, and also research on more like the technical policy mix story that's getting a lot of attention by policy scholars. Which of those two do you think in your world is better tended to by this kind of think tank, or both, or how would you do it?
That's a tough question for me, but maybe I'll answer it with another question, unfortunately, or a point. But I think it's really tricky when we look at things like, say, segregation of plastic, right? Because if we segregate the plastic, it's much easier to upcycle that plastic. Right. But in Singapore, most of us, we live in high rises, some 30, 40, 50 stories tall. We all have these trash bin chutes, and to segregate and carry it down the elevator, I have to say I'm a bit pessimistic that it's going to happen. Whereas in the States, I think we were segregating aluminum cans when I was a kid, so that was quite a while back. So it's like some of these things don't seem to apply broadly across the geographic diversity that we have. So I guess there's no one answer. It's going to be, have to look at it place by place. But in like recycled water, where I work frequently, in that case, it's very critical that the public buy in, because they're initially afraid of potable water reuse. But of course, Singapore, with its new water, Orange County, California, have really done a good job. But I think those cases in Australia where it failed was really because of public perception and people worried about being reelected, I guess. So you've just nicely connected to Professor DeBosch's point about then abstract and concrete, right? We've got a really concrete idea for the Institute, policy options for recycling in the context of Singapore, lessons from elsewhere, right? And this could be a really cool analysis that would require your interventions
the abstract concrete, and everybody in this panel in ways that I think can make a difference. So I'm going to advocate that as the helper in creating this institute as one really concrete option that actually came to us during our conversations and our webinars with Professor Yaqub Ibrahim, who was a former environment minister here in Singapore. So anyway, so this is the way to say this kind of conversation is very much the way we want to support these projects and programs. I'm going to now go to our next speaker, who I'm very excited to welcome too, because he plays a unique role in this conversation around how do we build fit for purpose think tanks, and who now works in a think tank whose purpose is to advise the government of Singapore on policy options. So we're looking forward to his contribution to this conversation. Just again, briefly, a wonderful background and CV as well. Dr. Wu Jinji is a senior research fellow in the Governance and Economy Department of the Institute of Policy Studies, IPS. His research interests include urban policy, economic development, and very much related to the environmental crisis management in Asia. He has published several books on Singapore's development as a global financial center, and his research has been published in a range of leading journals. Prior to joining IPS, he was assistant professor and program leader at the Education University of Hong Kong, where he led the formation of a bachelor's degree program in policy sciences and management. He was also the Rajawali Fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government in Harvard University, where he studied policy co-creation in Boston's Technology Center. And he is he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School for Innovative Cities and has his PhD from our very own Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So with that, I welcome to respond to the first question, offer his insights, Dr. Wu Jinji. Welcome.
Thank you, Prof. Ben. Thank you for having me. And it's challenging coming on the back of these three wonderful speakers because they've said so much. But I think I wanted to highlight three important aspects of the new institute that sort of speaks to the issues that we need to look at. So the first of all, certainly this is an institute that is located in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, and there is a lot of regional interest in energy, in transboundary air pollution, for obvious reasons. These are things that are impacting people. So certainly there is that. And I'll pick on Prof. Schneider's point about new water. And certainly there's been a lot of success with water treatment in Singapore. So Singapore is a place that is small, but has done quite a fair bit for itself in the discharge of treating the discharge of wastewater, things like that. So I think leveraging on these and sort of tapping on the regional interests would be important. These are big areas. And certainly I'm not coming from a climate change background, but I think the emphasis on Public Policy Institute, that using of policy lenses to frame pressing issues that make sense to policymakers and to the public. And I think we've heard a lot about concretizing some of these policy issues, looking at things that are really long-term and taking a holistic aspect. And I think we do have the tools to look at some of these things in your own work on super wicked problems. The first fundamental characteristic of time is running out. So that sort of connects to what Prof. Schneider was talking about, that these are long-term issues. And we were talking about just recently policy triggers. So I think we could leverage on some of these concepts and sort of frame these environmental issues, these really super wicked long-term issues, and sort of think of solutions that can be advanced today. So that to me is an important part of what the think tank does. We concretize a pressing policy issue. We show them that we have a certain set of tools that can make sense of these issues. And perhaps in a way, we advocate for certain solutions that are geared to solving long-term problems, even if the impetus for doing so was not there in the first place. So I think that framing the public policy emphasis would be really important. And certainly looking at the list of issues, I think they're comprehensive. And certainly there are other connections to other policy areas. For me, in my work at least, sustainability fits in. It's like a background issue to all the things we do. Every policy area that we look at is somewhat connected to climate change, sustainability. I look at global financial centers, but we're talking about climate financing today, green finance. So there's a lot of scope to connect to other policy areas. And here is where we could tap on the third aspect of the new institute. It's embeddedness within a broader LKY school ecosystem, that leveraging on other experts, looking at human nature interactions, financing, health sustainability impacts, even behavioralism. So I think there are a whole host of issues, regional, analytical, and some of it is connecting sustainability to other policy areas that are equally pressing to policymakers.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I want to maybe ask you a follow-up question. We appreciate that we've got you here to give a perspective on a think tank designed to actually provide practical advice to the government of Singapore, something we hope to do ourselves in this new institute as well. I want to ask you then, going back to, again, Professor Debash's point about abstract concrete, and we've got Professor Schneider's point about a very concrete idea around recycling could actually improve a range of challenges. In your experience and your thoughts, we've identified 4 pillars as a way to house the new think tank. One is climate and energy as a pillar. One is circular economy. Another is biodiversity conservation, and the final one is water and oceans. In your own experience, given you've got a broader set of challenges also that you're working on or that you do work on, do you think those pillars capture well the sustainability file, or are there things that you would add to it or take away from in terms of the institute?
Yeah, I think some of these have been mentioned, but I would add to it the human aspect or the urban aspect of sustainability. Urban livability is certainly a huge issue. The livability of cities will impact how we consume our resources and how other parts of the world, the non-urban world, will be organized in collective action. Yeah. So I think that the urban aspect will be important. It could come in as another pillar, or it could be infused across the 4 pillars. I think there's a little bit of a flexibility here. Within each pillar, there are many subdivided areas that we think about, whether it's human interactions, urban development, policy, regulation. So I would say that if I was to think of something that was missing, it would possibly be that behavioral urban aspect.
Thank you very much. In fact, the role of cities in the context of climate change is a very big topic, as all of our speakers know. And so your point's really well taken. And we've now got some seed funding to do a little bit of research on that very question. So yeah, well taken. Okay, so now I'm going to come to the second, I think, really important question for our panel. And so I'm going to, again, ask all panelists of this question in the same order as before. And this is the question, okay? And I really want the answer to this question. I just need to know what the answer is to this question. So from your experience working in these kinds of think tanks, providing actual advice to governments, to stakeholders, what kinds of research and policy analysis, do you feel is most useful for this kind of institute to generate knowledge around these problems that will be the most useful for governments, intergovernmental efforts, and practitioners? And I mean, like, concretely, is it policy briefs? Is it cost-benefit analysis? Is it certain kinds of ways of conducting policy analysis? Is it IPCC reviews? What's the best way to do this to provide the knowledge? Okay, we need the answer to this question. And so we'll start with Professor Navroz Debash.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And it was great to hear all our colleagues. And I look forward to engaging through the rest of this as well. That, like all the questions, these are very large, and we can at most touch on a couple of things. So let me pull out a couple of slightly unusual angles to this question. In my experience, one of the challenges in getting environmental issues taken seriously, particularly in poorer countries, right, where there are going to be other things that just are higher up the policy agenda, is how do you frame these things again in a way that how do you frame environmental challenges in a way that they're relevant, and how do you acknowledge that it may not be the primary objective of a policymaker? So, for example, certainly climate change in much of the developing world, it's not going to be the driving objective. It's not going to be greenhouse gas emissions. It's going to be other things that are important. And Dr. Wu Jinji just talked about the urban importance of the urban spaces, and I really agree with that. So one kind of policy approach and analysis that helps us with this is multi-objective approaches. So explicitly recognizing that we're not trying to solve one problem. We have to kind of satisfice across multiple problems. We're simultaneously looking at greenhouse gases, sure. We might also be looking at local air pollution. We're almost certainly going to be looking at jobs and impact on job creation or avoidance of job losses. We're going to be looking at things like energy security, and these might all be in play at the same time. And so to use the sort of technical jargon, multi-criteria decision analysis, which is an approach that says we know we have multiple criteria at work, is a really good way to approach some of these problems. And it turns on its head sort of older conventional cost-benefit analysis approaches that say, look, you know, if you're doing cost and benefits against one objective, and also an earlier way of thinking about policy challenges coming out of economics that says you literally have to have one instrument tied to one objective. Well, no. Increasingly, we're talking about how do you hit multiple buttons at the same time, recognizing that there may be synergies across them. The example I gave earlier of air pollution and climate, or congestion in cities and climate, but there may also be trade-offs. So, for example, in India, there's an active debate going on around using gas for cooking, which has enormous social gains, in particular to women in rural areas, because they get away from the drudgery of collecting firewood. But gas is a greenhouse gas. It's cheap, it's cleaner than coal, but it is a greenhouse gas. And so there's a trade-off there where you're achieving a social objective, but you might be contributing to climate change. And in the short run, you may choose that that's something as a poorer country you need to consider while transitioning to electricity-based cooking as soon as possible, ideally fueled by renewable energy. So the multi-criteria approach is one idea. And then related to that, and you've written about this, Ben, is the idea of policy mixes or packages. The fact that it's not just about a carbon tax or a subsidy or a regulation. Often you have to look at how these things work together in bringing about a transition. And particularly in the energy and climate space these days, we're talking about inducing these sorts of transitions over time, which mean both nudging things we want to happen, as well as finding ways of maybe easing out things that we don't want to happen. So finding ways of phasing out fossil fuels, lowering fossil fuel subsidies, addressing the fact that many fossil fuel industries have a considerable amount of political power in many jurisdictions. So those policy packages and how you design them to bring about transitions is another set of questions that I think a school like this would be really well placed to take on. Many more things one could talk about. I'm sure my fellow panelists will have lots to suggest. So I'll just pause there and look forward to hearing from the rest of them.
Thank you, and I appreciate the two themes coming out. One, the multiple criteria approach really does reinforce the ideas from previous speakers that we've got to be, as Professor Snyder said, honest with governments about the various problems that we're facing. And by bringing in a range of criteria, you can best do that, right? So being honest, but also then opening up the idea on your second point about policy mixes and policy packages, which I would reinforce that a policy school like LTIY school is so well poised to do that. We have so many excellent scholars on that very kind of question. So thank you, including our fourth speaker. Now over to Maria Ivanova. I did want to also add that, just so you're all aware, she got up very early in the morning. I think like 5 in the morning for this seminar. So I appreciate her efforts in doing that. But over to you on then, what kinds of research? What do you find is the best for this kind of institute?
So as I was listening to this, I have two ideas. One is on the what kinds of research, and the other is how or what kinds of methods for that research. How
Right.
do you, what is the process? So the substance and the process. And in a sense, that will address the question that I just saw in the Q&A by Steve Rhee, who's also one of my classmates at Yale. So it's wonderful to see that Steve is now with you at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And I was like, Steve, great to at least hear you here. But Steve is asking, who do you want to do what? And that's in terms of the substance, but also how do you get those things, those people and institutions to do something about it? And let me tackle that one first, the process. And I think that's really, really critical. And we have to unlearn a lot of our practices in academia, especially in the science field, where we feel like, oh, we know what the solutions are. We know the answers to the questions. What is critical is that we communicate them to policymakers, and then that they take the right decisions. We see the science policy interface as a unidirectional feed of analysis and solution to the policymakers, which then take the decisions and pass policies and laws, and then the public, the business adopts them, and then solution is produced and problem solved. That never happens. It just doesn't, because as Shane Snyder was saying, there's the human dimension. We can't make people to change unless they want to do so. But how do you convince them to do so? And so in a policy center, institute, school, the critical issue is at the science policy interface is the co-creation of knowledge. And so the way that we have done this at the Center for Governance and Sustainability that I direct is not going to policymakers and saying, here's what you should know, but bringing policymakers in, those convenings that you were talking about, Ben, and asking, what questions do you have? And then rather than starting with our answers and telling them what to do, we start with their questions, and then we pose them to the researchers. It's like, how do you address these questions? For example, we had an officer from UNEP, the UN Environment Program, come and say, can you do a paper on the effectiveness of multilateral environmental agreements? Because we're really interested in that. And that started a whole project that has now become the Environmental Conventions Index. And this brings me to my second point about the substance. We just heard a lot about COP26. We will continue to hear a lot more. The focus was on ambition, 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 right? We need more ambitious goals. However, there's the other side. There's ambition, but there's implementation. How do you actually implement? How do you make countries deliver on the goals that they have committed to? And this, in a sense, is exactly what UNEP asked us in 2013. And this is what we have been producing as a knowledge product, this Environmental Conventions Index that codes and then gives a ranking of how countries implement their commitments. So point one, you have to co-create knowledge. You have to ask policymakers of what their questions are. And point two, you have to deliver on that. And so don't only focus on the debate of what are our ambitions and our commitments, but how do we deliver on those commitments? And that will help us answer Steve's question of who do you want to do what, when, and how.
Yeah, thank you so much. The co-creation idea, we really embrace and respect, because after all, we know that as policy scientists, we can write articles about topics that nobody reads about, and therefore it has no practical utility, right? And that's not the purpose of this institute at all. So how you co-create, I think, is a really important point, and you raised some ideas about that. My last question, we'll get into that some more, actually, so it's nicely placed for the third round of questions. And I appreciate that time is actually ticking, which is one of the key features of a super big problem like climate change and this really important discussion webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Snyder and say, yeah, what kinds of policy analysis and research is the best for this kind of institute? What do you think?
Well, that's a tricky one for me. Again, I come back to the engineering side and what
Yeah.
our struggles to see implemented, some of the discoveries and I don't mean low, what we call TRL, the high TRL, the low hanging fruit, such as certain carbon capture technology. So, what just in one example maybe I can give is back to the plastic one, right? So we have this technologies that can convert mixed plastic waste into different types of fuels or different types of polymers, or even upcycling to carbon nanofiber. So here's just an interesting one to me. You guys could feed back to me another time even, but we sought to deploy that in Singapore, and we ran into all kinds of strange things that we didn't expect. That, for instance, once people know that a waste product has value, they no longer wish to give it away. Who owns the plastic waste? In Singapore, you might be surprised, if some of you probably already know the answer to this, belongs to NEA the minute you throw it away. So then you have to secure this kind of agreements, which is not a major obstacle in Singapore. But the experience I wanted to share was, how do we get this into the hands of Indonesia with 285 million people versus our wonderful 5.5 million on our small island? And actually our impact can be far greater if we got this into Indonesia than implementing every scrap piece of plastic in Singapore being recycled. And interestingly, and I thought this is what the point I really wanted to share, was that even from a policy standpoint, I was told that if we could get a developing country like Indonesia or Thailand or even Myanmar to begin to implement this type of technology, it's more impactful than if Singapore were to do it, because people look at us as a super high per capita GPD, and people will just say, hey, the rich kid got a new toy, that's really nice, but can we do it? And they want to almost give up. So I mentioned we have our own endowment at NURI, and so the Lien Foundation that funds us or provided the endowment said, let's get this technology, high technology, into the developing parts of the world first, and let them show it can be done. And then people will be more apt to emulate. They'll be say, hey, if Indonesia can do it, well, certainly we can do it. So I know that might be a bit off of your question, Benjamin.
No,
but I'm not so much in the trenches with the policy discussion, but I know that it's frustrating for us when we have something that we think is been proven to work, and then trying to actually get it to be implemented. And maybe I could just kind of wrap it up by bringing back the point I made before, because I feel so strongly about it, and that is that long-term thinking, that it's not too expensive, because almost everything that I see come to a halt comes to a halt when someone says, well, how much is that going to cost? And I wish they would ask, how much is that going to cost over the next century, or at least 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and not look at, hey, how much does that cost immediately to implement, but what's that long-term gain? And part of the question I think you gave me in advance was, how do we see the best way to move things forward? And I'll end this with saying demonstration scale facilities. So what we like to do is build, and New Water is a great example, build a demonstration, you get people to come and actually see it, to experience it, to get their hands on it, instead of just showing them a CAD drawing that us engineers have built up and a theoretical paper published in a high impact journal, to actually be able to touch it, see it, and realize that we can do it. And again, hopefully can do it in the countries that need it the most.
I'm so grateful that you're here and for this, your points, because you mentioned one point on this diffusion question. How can countries learn from Singapore? How can you actually get policies or behaviors in places and engineering solutions in places where the populations are so much larger and the impacts are so huge? Diffusion of policy making and ideas from one jurisdiction to another is what we do well in policy schools. But do we talk to engineers about this? Rarely, right? So this kind of conversation about how to link those knowledge sources, to me, is really, really fundamental. And so I'm really grateful for this intervention. I also would add too, you mentioned demonstration projects. We have a leading scholar on what's called policy pilots in our school. Srijaner, and she works on this. And she's done this research in India and globally on this very question. We must talk to each other. You could imagine a linking policy of pilots with demonstration projects around the diffusion of these regulatory environments that could encourage this would be a really important part of this kind of an institute. And as Maria said, in collaboration with others like your own. So thank you. Just wonderful points to reinforce this conversation. JJ, you know, this is what you guys do, right? You generate this knowledge for government agencies and officials. So what works best in your world?
Sure. Thank you, Ben. And well, to start off, I'll pick up on what Dr. Ivanova talked about, where she said that we have to unlearn practices from academia. And I found that to be so true. I mean, I've been moving in and out of think tanks and into faculty departments, back to think tanks again. And the style of writing, I must say that think tank work is highly client-centric, asking what stakeholders, what questions they have, but also providing writing that is common, that's understandable to them. So policy briefs are a huge aspect of what we do, whether it's in IPS or in previous think tanks I've worked in. Writing them in, we know that civil servants in Singapore, they spend their time writing a lot of policy briefs. So writing it in a format that they understand, almost a similar format that we teach our MPPs here, that really helps a lot. It really helps them understand what we're trying to say, to codify what we know in a way that makes sense to them. Another thing that works is case studies. So comparative case studies, drawing key lessons from other jurisdictions and creating a sort of case study for them. And I think the biggest challenge for think tank is to align this sort of writing with the KPI of the researchers, with the career aspirations of the junior researchers. So I think there is that aspect of think tank work. And it's not for everybody, that's for sure. The other thing are engaging stakeholders through programs. Before I left Harvard, they set up the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. So, but there was not a lot of output coming out of that. There was a constant engagement with mayors, with junior policymakers. So that sort of engagement, while it doesn't create a concrete sort of output, in the long term, I think it does generate some interest. It's building up trust with the stakeholders, with policymakers. And the last thing that we do a lot here is commentary pieces in the media, pieces that are punchy, short, gets the public's attention. And public policy, we'll call this a little bit of agenda setting, trying to get the issue to gain traction, and policymakers will address it from that end as well. So a lot of stakeholder management, which I suspect we are going to be talking about in a while, and a lot of trying to write in a style that is not too academic, it's understandable by policymakers.
Yeah. Very useful. I mean, both in the agenda setting side, just raising the problems and getting attention that can assist governments and other actors in championing these questions. And as Nava said, their interaction too. I'm just curious too, you work on policy design, policy mixes, you're one of the experts in this area. If they're really important for making impactful policies, but like, I don't know, medical doctors, they're also complicated, right? So how do you then take this complicated knowledge, not to mention the engineering and the science behind these problems, and then translate that to governments who could use it to develop more effective policies? How do you do that?
Well, one of the ways is to use case study material to concretize what a policy mix is. Get let's say the Singapore Green Plan 2030, clearly a policy mix. What are instruments? What are old instruments? What are legacy instruments? What are instruments that have been layered on? Has there been integration of instruments? So that is one way for the rank and file civil servant. They don't think in terms of policy mixes. Yeah. They think in terms of programs, initiatives, costs and benefits.
Right.
So it's a way translating the things we know into the context that these people work in. So that helps a lot, I would say.
Okay,
and also another area that I work on in policy capacity, that is much more amenable to translating something useful. So in a book that I'm going to be publishing in a couple of months, I included a capacity checklist. So in a way, coming up with indices, checklists, things that make sense to policymakers that are immediately applicable on the operational side. I think that helps a lot.
Thank you. Excellent. That's really helpful. Yeah. And again, fundamental for not ignoring, but incorporating the knowledge in ways that can be useful. And we definitely want that to be our mission in this new institute. We've got some questions coming up. So some have already been answered, but I want to raise a couple. One is by Philip Lee, who talks about how in one of the previous sessions, the panelists shared that more can be done by institutions like LKY School. He writes, to help governments with the policy and even be the bridge to communicate between companies, NGOs, and governments. So his question is, what more can institutions do in that regard? What are the challenges? And also, I thought, really important question, what are the challenges that prevent you from doing that? Any takers? Maria?
I'll say what are the challenges where I sit. I don't know in your school, and I'd love to hear how you deal with these issues. But in essence, in academia, and that's the issue with what JJ was talking about, is that you're freer in these think tanks outside of academia. And so when you're in a institute within academia, how can you combine both worlds? It's a really interesting dynamic. And this to me is the biggest challenge, is the assessment of faculty work within those institutes. How are we judged for promotion, for visibility, for any assessment within the university? And I'm not talking about monetary remuneration. No, just the recognition of the value of your work. If that challenge is resolved within those institutes of faculty who do teaching, who do research, who have this public outreach, if they feel that their work is valued and is valuable, both within the institution and outside the institution, I think a lot of these challenges will be resolved. Because right now, what do we have this dichotomy between academia with the papers and the assessments of what is the impact factor of the journal. That means it shouldn't be readable. And in the policy institutes outside of academia. And so what you're doing then is creating something within academia, but with bigger reach. And to me, the key challenge will be to solve that assessment and recognition, so that you can invite more faculty, more students, more researchers from the outside to do that.
I want to take Maria's answer and then turn to the other panelists in the time we have remaining, because as you all know, one of the big challenges is how to create the incentives for faculty to work on real world issues. It sounds like ridiculous, right? But we know that they're judged on a narrow set of publications, oftentimes in their tenure process. Engaging stakeholders isn't always one of those criteria, and yet we know that it should be to be meaningful, right? So how do we create those incentives when so many times institutionally, the deck is stacked against those who want to make a difference in the world? How can we as an institute reverse those incentives in some way to align better those career prospects, but also making a real world difference? I want you all to get a chance to say a couple of words on that before we close up. So over to, let's go Professor Dubach, and then Snyder, and then Jing Wu.
Well, this is I completely agree. This is a real challenge. The incentive structures are not favorable for academics to really engage the policy world, and it's even sort of disdained in some contexts as being sort of a lesser form of engagement. I've been fortunate in a sense in my own career to move back and forth between universities and think tanks, and of course, in a think tank, sometimes the incentives are reversed the other way,
right,
where what is valorized is proving that you have the year of government, and so it actually can lead to a little bit of a race to the bottom, where there are think tanks scrambling. Sometimes too many think tanks in too few years, in a sense, to speak into, and sometimes even having contradictory opinions. So I just want to, I don't have a helpful suggestion on the very important question that Maria raised, but I do want to caution against the other side, right? That in some ways, it's really important that the advice also be robust.
Right.
I'll give you just one example. You know, in the build up to Paris, there were think tanks running around in India giving numbers on how much the sort of the increase in renewable energy in India to 100 gigawatts would cost. And there were order of magnitude differences in the estimates.
Right.
And there were some hapless, relatively, scientifically trained, but relatively low-level director who had to sort this out and try and shape policy based on it. And so I think that actually making sure that that advice is based on peer review is also really important. And that's where I think, let me flip it back to the role of a school like this, actually convening people to make sure that that advice is brokered in a sense, and its implications, not just its quality, but also its implications thought through in that kind of multi-objective way we discussed earlier, is really important. So there's a curation process that a think tank can also provide. It's not just providing the advice, but also curating different voices and helping frame how you sift through different and sometimes contradictory points of view is a really important role.
Fascinating. So it's that integration of both those communities versus just doing one or the other. Yeah,
Correct.
Fantastic. And that's going to be our goal and also our challenge, as we're hearing. Yeah, Professor Schneider, what are your thoughts on that perennial challenge?
Well, again, I keep returning back to this idea of having, the ability to have demonstration facilities or demonstrations where we can bring people together. And I was just taking a note to myself. I heard Maria use that term co-creation, and I think that that's really important to be able to bring together these groups that are sometimes living in silos separately from one another, to have that really broad open discussion again about the full life cycles and cradle to grave concepts that go beyond the immediate way we look at things. So I think so far I've already heard a lot of new ideas that are exciting, in terms of trying to bring people together for change. And as I said before, that hopefully that we get beyond just CO2 accounting and look more broadly. And I wanted to just throw one thing in there as a final statement, maybe get the chance. In the meeting we had this week with China and Singapore, the discussion of nuclear power came up. And I know I don't want to derail this whole thing, but when we talk about renewable energy and wind, it's not going to get us there entirely, right? And yet nuclear energy certainly has that capability and largely been dismissed for much of the developed world. And I think that's just something, I know it's a tangential, maybe really throwing a spanner into things by me bringing it up, but it's fun to get it out there. It's topics like that I think we need to come back to. Harnessing all the wind of the earth could cause a lot of damage too, that unforeseen, ideas, that changing weather patterns and such. And the idea of damming the entire Mekong River from the Himalayas all the way down to Vietnam was brought up in our discussion. And a lot of countries did that, like Brazil and Zimbabwe, and now the reservoirs are dry and they have rolling blackouts. So, I hope that we could get around, this kind of honest discussion of solutions. And if we're going to say oppose nuclear power, to do it in a way that's honest about how many lives have been impacted and the real risks. So as from an engineering standpoint, I hope we can move beyond just fossil fuel bans and things like that and think more holistically about what's best for the planet.
Yeah, and that goes back to co-creation that's come up as the theme, and also the way in which dialogues around both the problems and the policy solutions can be had in a very purposeful way, I think is a really important theme. So again, thank you for that. JJ, yeah.
Sure. I think we've touched on a really important aspect of think tank work. That is the alignment of the researchers' career interests and the think tank's needs and interests. And sometimes, in my time at multiple think tanks, I've seen people get burnt out. I've seen people leave. I've seen people stay on and thrive. Sometimes it's a matter of personality. Some people are good at convening events, managing stakeholders and policymakers. And sometimes there are those who want to be academics and scholars that publish in journals. So I think there's an aspect of reframing the work for some of the faculty. Reframing in terms of being change agents, but yet having the space to do some of the academic stuff that they like. So unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer. Sometimes, as it happens, there are faculty members who are able to thrive in a think tank environment, and sometimes it doesn't work for everyone. So being honest and being clear about what the incentives are within the institute would help, and also trying to motivate faculty in a way that to help them see the value of their work. That I think would help as well.
Thank you. And there are concrete ideas from that. For example, perhaps research funds that would include a commitment to engage in a dialogue after your research is done, right? And you can find some synergies this way, which wouldn't be too hard. You know, I would just mention, given our time is now coming to an end, Utrecht University has at a university-wide level addressed this very conversation and said they're going to move away from citation indexes as their ranking and look instead at real world impacts. And the first speaker we had in our first panel, Hans Breinix, who's the head of the European Environment Agency, got a PhD in global environmental governance. He said to me a few times in response to this conversation that his impact factor is section 18.2 of the Belgian Constitution. And I love that one. You know, there's different ways of doing impact, and it's so important. Before we close, before I recognize Maria, I just wanted to say, I neglected to mention that she's involved in a Carnegie Foundation study on reimagining environmental multilateralism by empowering small states. So this will be of interest to Singapore and our new institute. And she's happy to connect with you on that. Her email is maria.ivanova, IVANOVA at UMB, M as in Mary, UMB.edu. You can Google her anyway and it'll pop up everywhere. But before I close, Maria, did you want to say anything?
I did. Yeah. And because, Ben, we have this tradition. So as you mentioned, you and I co-taught a class and we had this wonderful tradition. Ben would say something and I would say, oh, but I don't agree. Let me provide a different point, and vice versa. And this was the most dynamic class. So you just suggested that you provide research funds after research is done to have these convenings and policy dialogues. I would say I would disagree, and I would suggest that you provide the research funds before research is undertaken for convenings, that you create the convenings before the research begins so that you can take in that co-creation element of asking the policymakers for questions rather than after the research is done to communicate the findings.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Maria, we don't disagree, I just misspoke. So I completely support your point and appreciate the intervention. Let me just say, this was for me a really informative and important and impactful conversation across the diversity of knowledge lenses around how to develop think tanks to make a difference and how scholars can be part of that conversation. I already see some good projects from this conversation going forward, linking communities. And I'm hearing also then that policy think tanks can't operate in isolation, but with other, to quote Maria, collaborators. And so this has been really useful. And thank you so much to the four of you. Everybody, please join me, in Zoom land in thanking our speakers for such a wonderful, informative panel that will most assuredly integrate into our final design of the new institute. So with that, I wish you all a good evening, and Maria, a good day. And she's going to have to teach a 3-hour class now too. So good luck with your class too. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great conversation.
Thanks. Bye.